Hi, Kees.
Hi, Greg. Good afternoon. We are hearing you with 20 people. We can see you very well. Great that you can join us. Would you like to put your PowerPoint on in your Skype?
Yeah, I'm just looking for the share screen.
I think it's somewhere on the right bottom, right?
Yeah, but he might have an older version. Then it should be like 3 lines.
This is good.
Yes, that's... Yeah,
yes,
excellent.
good.
Excellent.
Great. Technology is our friend today. Is the audio okay for you?
Yeah, I think the audio is very good. So we are here at the Nyenrode University. There's 20 people in the hall. There's also, we're recording everything to put a video publish later on. And so, please shoot, Greg. Go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, commissioners, especially for giving me a chance to share with you some of my research. It's a great honour to make a small contribution to the vital inquiry you're undertaking into fossil fuel companies and climate change. I'm really sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm glad that so far the technology seems to be working and we're able to connect. To introduce myself, I'm Greg Muttit. I'm Research Director at Oil Change International. Oil Change International is a research and advocacy group which focuses on accelerating the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And my research specifically relates to what do the Paris goals mean for fossil fuels and especially fossil fuel extraction. So I'm going to talk about what Shell says and perhaps does on climate change and how it relates to the Paris goals. And last year, Shell released 2 important reports on this subject, which I'm going to address in this presentation. The first of them was called Sky. It described a scenario, a potential future, which Shell claimed would be aligned with the Paris goals. And secondly, it released a report called the Energy Transition Report, which described what Shell was doing in relation to climate change. So I'm mainly going to focus on these 2 reports. I'm going to talk you through them. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about what Shell would have to do to be properly aligned with the Paris goals. Please interrupt me if the audio gets bad at any point or if what I say is unclear. But I'm also looking forward to taking your questions at the end, and I'd be very happy to follow up afterwards with any more details or references that you need. So this first graph, I'm going to show you a number of graphs, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I'll try and explain what they're all saying, and we can also explore more in the Q&A at the end. So Shell's Sky scenario, this is what it describes up to 2050 for the global consumption and production of the 3 fossil fuels. What you can see is that oil and gas, even in 3 decades' time, Shell expects to be at roughly the same levels as today, not significantly declining. And even coal only declines by about a quarter or a third. Of course, this future would be very good for Shell itself. It suggests a large future demand for Shell's core products. It suggests plenty of profitability for Shell. But what is perhaps more surprising to the rest of us is Shell's claim that it is aligned with the Paris goals when there is this much fossil fuels. And I'm going to make the argument that actually it's not aligned with the Paris goals, and I'll show you why. So firstly, let's look at the emissions in the Shell Sky scenario and compare them with scenarios published by the IPCC that would lead to a 1.5 degree of warming. The Shell scenario, the emissions from energy and industrial processes, they're shown in the red line there. And the blue lines show different scenarios that were used in the recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. What you can see here is that the Shell scenario is well out of line with the IPCC 1.5 degree scenarios. Most of those IPCC scenarios get to zero emissions sometime around 2050 or soon after, whereas emissions in the Shell Sky scenario only fall by about 1/3 between now and 2050. We can also compare the Shell Sky scenario with IPCC 2 degrees scenarios, also from that same report. And what you see here is that, well, it's not outside all of them, but it's at the very high end of the range. What that means is that if the world follows the course set out in the Shell scenario, we have a fairly low probability of keeping warming below 2 degrees by comparison with those other scenarios. So we know that the Paris goals are to keep warming not to 2 degrees, but well below 2 degrees, and to pursue efforts to keep it to 1.5 degrees. I think in terms of the emissions, we can't say that the Shell Sky scenario is aligned with the Paris goals, because at very best, it takes us to a small chance of keeping warming to 2 degrees. And as we know in particular from the recent IPCC report, 2 degrees of warming will be extremely dangerous, and especially for the world's poorest people. You may also have seen a scientific paper last year which warned that there's a significant risk that if warming goes up to 2 degrees, the Earth could flip into a hothouse state where you get cascading and self-reinforcing impacts, meaning that warming would keep going up out of control, and regardless of what human beings did after that. So Shell Sky scenario leads us to a dangerous future that isn't aligned with the Paris goals. But as I said, the Shell emissions, although they're not aligned with the Paris goals, in this scenario they fall by about 1/3 between now and 2050. But as we saw in the first graph, oil and gas use remain roughly the same, and coal only slightly lower. Well, how can this be the case? The reason is that Shell assumes new technology will be available to both capture emissions as they are emitted from burning fossil fuels, so we can continue using fossil fuels but not letting the emissions into the atmosphere, and also to suck carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere after it's been emitted. Now, there are two main technologies that the Shell Sky scenario relies on. One is carbon capture and storage of carbon dioxide that's released from burning fossil fuels, and the other is carbon capture and storage combined with bioenergy to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What this graph shows you is that in 2070, Shell is assuming that between those two technologies, they will enable fossil fuels to the extent of about 18 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which what the bar on the right shows you is that's roughly equivalent to about half of today's carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and from cement production. So Shell is assuming that these technologies will work out and that they will be available at an absolutely vast scale, that an infrastructure will be built to produce, transport and burn bioenergy, to capture, transport and bury carbon dioxide. And for example, the pipeline infrastructure just to carry the carbon dioxide would be many times the size of today's fossil gas infrastructure. As you may know, over recent years, companies and governments have grown a lot more sceptical about the prospects of carbon capture and storage, whereas perhaps 10 years ago they were much more optimistic. Many companies and governments have withdrawn from investment in carbon capture and storage because from the 20 or 25 pilot projects around the world, they're finding that carbon capture and storage, CCS, is a lot more expensive than they thought or hoped, and a lot more difficult. Turning to the bioenergy with CCS portion, scientific researchers have estimated that to deliver this amount of bioenergy, as shown in this graph, would require a land area devoted to bioenergy production equivalent to up to 1.5 times the size of India, or 1/3 of the world's total crop growing area. Now, of course, that would have a profound impact on the amount of land that's available for growing food, and also on forests and biodiversity. So what we see in this scenario is not only is it aiming for a very limited chance of keeping warming to the dangerous level of 2 degrees, but it only does so while making a massive gamble on the availability of unknown, difficult and socially impactful technologies at a very large scale. And the one thing to add here is that Shell isn't proposing that it pays for these technologies to offset its own contribution to climate change. It's saying that government should pay for these technologies. Because it argues that Shell is not the one causing climate change, it is people who consume energy who cause climate change and governments who are responsible for addressing it. So that brings me on to what does Shell say that it's going to do or not do about climate change, and the second report, the Energy Transitions report. Shell has committed not to reducing its own emissions, but to reducing the emissions per unit that it produces, so the emissions per barrel of oil, or more precisely per unit of energy that it produces. At the same time, it plans to continue growing the total of energy that it produces. Now, I've illustrated that in a graph here. Shell, over the last 3 or 4 years, grew at an average rate. Its production of fossil fuels, of oil and gas, grew at an average rate of 3.5% per year, which is commonly a target that Shell aims for. Now, Shell doesn't set long-term growth targets, it sets short-term growth targets, but if you extended this out, if Shell sustained growth of 3.5% per year, then its total production would triple between now and 2050. Shell has committed to reducing the intensity of what it produces by 50%, which would mean taking off that lighter grey portion there. What you see is that even if you save emissions by moving to relatively cleaner fuels or relatively more efficient fuels, that is outweighed by Shell's plans to grow. And the result is the emissions from Shell's products still continue to grow until 2050, and of course beyond. And of course that's not consistent with the Paris goals, which require quite a rapid reduction of emissions. It can only be consistent if all other oil and gas companies reduce their production. And like Shell, of course, they plan to increase as well. So Shell's approach to climate change is summed up in this sentence. Shell intends to thrive as the world transitions to lower carbon energy. Shell is not planning to make the transition to lower carbon energy itself. It sees that as being the role of governments and of consumers who consume energy products. What Shell intends to do is to thrive, to remain profitable, while governments and consumers take responsibility for climate change. By way of analogy, imagine if a cigarette company in the court cases over the health impacts of tobacco said, well, we're not responsible for the health impacts of our products. All we're responsible for is remaining profitable while smokers reduce the amount they're smoking and governments address it. It's a denial of culpability from what Shell does. And Shell itself, perhaps inadvertently, acknowledges the impact of continuing to build oil and gas infrastructure, which it does, which is the problem known as carbon lock-in. When you build a piece of infrastructure, it makes it more difficult for competing sources of energy because that capital has already been sunk, and because the energy system is locked into physical infrastructure that in many cases lasts 30, 40 years or even longer. The problem of lock-in, basically it means that decisions today shape our future for the very long term. And while there's been a lot of study of the economic effects of lock-in, the infrastructure effects of lock-in, there's increasing study today of also the social and political effects of lock-in. Socially, as long as the world keeps developing new oil, gas and coal infrastructure, it will lock in people's jobs into producing those fuels. And that makes it more socially disruptive to make the transition later. Politically, companies tend to lobby for their interests, and the more their interests are focused on fossil fuels, the more they lobby against action that would limit fossil fuel use. To illustrate that with Shell itself, Shell lobbied against, in 2016, Shell lobbied against Europe-wide mandatory targets on renewable energy, against targets on energy efficiency, and against targets on fuel efficiency. So by seeking to thrive as an oil and gas company, what it's actually doing is slowing down the transition. So these two quotes were taken from Shell's Sky scenario, and I would suggest that Shell accidentally starts to implicate itself to acknowledge its own culpability. Well, the reason Shell put them there is to say, well, it will be very difficult to shift the system in the next 10 or 15 years. In fact, the lock-in problem goes beyond that, and it is a problem that is caused by Shell's core activities. Now, does Shell at least help deliver the solutions to the problem? It might not be taking responsibility for the problem and for its own actions and decisions, but is it at least giving us some clean energy that allows consumers and governments to address the problem? My answer is, well, not really. This is from Shell's own documents. Shell now commits to investing between $1 and $2 billion per year in what it calls its new energy division. And that is out of a total capital investment of around 25 billion. In other words, oil and gas investment is between 10 and 20 times the size of its investments in the new energy division. And in fact, this graph understates the difference here, because new energy also includes fossil gas, transport and power generation. So only a portion of that orange bar on the right is actually renewable energy. So I'm going to finish by talking about what Shell would have to do to align with the Paris goals. The Paris goals, as we know, are to keep warming to well below 2 degrees and to keep to 1.5 degrees. And this graph shows some research I've done comparing developed fossil fuel reserves with carbon budgets. There have been a number of studies, in particular over the last 10 years, which compare total fossil fuel reserves with how much we ought to burn, and find that fossil fuel reserves are several times too large. What I did in my research was I focused just on the reserves where everything has already been built. So this is the oil fields which are already in production, the gas fields and coal mines which are already in production, where the pipelines have been built, where the pits have been dug, the wells have been drilled, the capital has been invested. And these are the ones where you get that problem of lock-in, because the money has been spent and the physical infrastructure has been built. So what the left-hand column shows you is what would be the emissions if all of the oil fields, gas fields, and coal mines operated for their full economic life, but no new ones were developed. And I've also made optimistic assumptions on limiting cement emissions and land use change emissions, which are at the bottom of that column. We compare these with carbon budgets for keeping warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. These carbon budgets are also taken from the recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. And what you see is that just the developed reserves, those in already producing fields and mines, would take the world to 2 degrees, almost. Now, oil companies like Shell and the others often say, well, the real problem is coal. What we need to do is focus on coal while continuing to produce more oil and gas. What this research shows is that even if, as of today, no more coal were burned, and remember that the vast majority of coal is burned in developing countries, So phasing it out will be particularly difficult. Even if no coal were burned from today, the oil and gas alone would take us past 1.5 degrees, even if no fields or mines or pipelines were developed beyond what we have already. The conclusion of this research that I draw is, as the old saying has it, when you're in a hole, you need to stop digging. We already have too much oil, gas and coal where everything has already been built to achieve the Paris goals. We need to stop building more and start looking at how we can close down some of those fields and mines before the end of their economic life. This next graphic just explains a bit more what this means. This is a graphic showing the life cycle of a typical oil or gas field. First, the company, the oil and gas company, explores for the resources. Secondly, after it has found some, it looks at them in more detail and decides how to develop them. And then it makes what's called a final investment decision, a decision to invest billions of dollars in the production of those reserves. Following that, it starts investing that money in the development for a couple of years or more, and then the course is set for the production from that field for 2 or more decades. Now, in that previous graph, what we counted in the left-hand column is everything that comes after a final investment decision. So where capital has started to be invested and where things have started to be built, because that's where you get the lock-in effect. My final graph just compares what we're talking about with numbers from the IPCC, the recent report. Now, the red line here shows a projection by an oil industry consultancy called Rystad Energy of how much oil and gas would be produced if the oil and gas industry gets its way and continues developing new fields. That's the red line at the top there. It continues to grow. It slows down, but it grows and then at best levels out until at least 2050. The blue line underneath that shows what would happen if you only took what was in that left-hand column earlier, stopped developing new fields and let the existing fields deplete. The production from them would decline over the coming decades as pressures in the reservoir fall, but it would slowly fall over the coming decades. Now, what the green portion shows here is one of the scenarios from the IPCC report. The IPCC report on 1.5 degrees contained 4 illustrative pathways which it focused on, showing how you could get to 1.5 degrees. The difference between the 4 was how much they bet on the availability of future technology, bridge and negative emissions. Now, this green portion shows one of those 4 pathways, the one which took the most conservative assumptions, assuming that CCS wouldn't work out, that there would not be future bioenergy with CCS. So on a precautionary approach, how quickly would global oil production have to decline? As you see, it's roughly in line with not developing new fields. So I'm going to conclude. Shell has published a description of the future. It calls it the Sky scenario, which it claims is aligned with the Paris goals, but would at best only lead to a limited chance of keeping warming to the dangerous level of 2 degrees, and even that only by gambling on the availability of future technology. Shell has not taken responsibility for its own contribution to climate change. All it has said is that it will try to remain profitable while allowing for a future that might look like the one it's just described. And actually, during this period, it plans to increase the emissions from its products. In order to properly align with the Paris goals, Shell needs to, the third point here, take responsibility for the emissions, not just the emissions per barrel that it extracts, the intensity. And what that means, I've made the case based on the science from the IPCC and others, that means stopping to develop new oil and gas fields and directing all new investment into clean energy. Unfortunately, right now, that's almost the opposite of what Shell is currently doing. I'm really looking forward to your reactions, your feedback, and I'd love to try and answer any questions you may have. both in this Q&A period now, but also please feel free to contact me if you would like more details or original references on anything I've shown. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Greg. This was very insightful. Thank you very much for this, this presentation. Would anybody like to ask a question to Greg or a comment? Maybe you want to come here, because otherwise I think you probably won't hear it.
Thank you.
Hello, Greg. That was very, very helpful, very insightful. I'm coming from a part of the world where we don't expect companies actually to listen to any sense of responsibility, because their responsibility is tied up with shareholders. So, okay, maybe Shell hasn't given the most attentive and comprehensive report, but why should it matter to Shell? I mean, it's cast a statement that, it's working with COP21 agreement, but COP21 has no authority over them, and it actually incorporates the governments where it's operating, and they're not bringing any pressure. So, they're more concerned with their stakeholders. So, okay, for a moment it might be bad image for them to a minority. But how is a Commission on Human Rights, in the far end of the Pacific, supposed to hold any sway in this argument? It's all very nice, but how do we hold sway coming from the Philippines? Have you any thoughts on that? Have you any advice for us?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the comments and the question. And I very much agree with you about what Shell's purpose is and how it sees its purpose. I think part of the reason it makes claims like those it made in those two reports last year is precisely to try to diffuse inquiries like the one by the Commission on Human Rights. I think one of Shell's big concerns is that it might lose the social license to operate, and that means both people's and governments' willingness to go along with the way Shell would like the world to be. It, as I mentioned, has lobbied against legislation that would be helpful to addressing climate change but unhelpful to Shell's profitability. And often it has succeeded in doing so. I think part of the real importance of the Commission on Human Rights is hold companies like Shell genuinely to account, and to make it much more difficult politically for governments to keep helping out companies like Shell when they lobby on legislation. I think the important thing for people and governments around the world is to recognize that we need a fundamental change in order to address climate change. And that change is so fundamental, it is not going to be delivered by oil and gas companies like Shell. And that's why I believe the Commission on Human Rights inquiry is so important, to shine a light on and see through the efforts of companies like Shell to essentially preserve the status quo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're facing an El Nino this year, and yes, we can trace that scientifically, but we don't seem to be able to trace it, shall I say, socially. We cannot get people to connect. This doesn't work with logic anymore. The only thing we end up is the horror of a disaster every few years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this is another drought, it's a creeping disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how, yes, a commission can respond to that when there's a certain government vacuum globally to take these things on. Yeah, remains a challenge. Yeah. So thank you.
Absolutely, that is our challenge. And the one note of perhaps optimism I would inject in response to that is that politics doesn't change linearly. You know, worldwide politics has, in my view, moved in the wrong direction over the last few years, and faster than we might have predicted perhaps 5 years ago. And because it's non-linear, I think the work of the likes of the Commission on Human Rights and of many of us who are working on these issues is to create the conditions where politics can move more quickly to where it needs to be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Excellent. This was very insightful. I think now we're going to move on to Laurie, our next speaker. If you want to watch that too, Greg, then I suggest that Eefje Skypes you in if you want to follow that as well. Yeah.
Yes, please. I would like to stay for Larry's presentation. I can't stay for all of the presentations today, but thank you again for having me. And if Eefje could Skype me in, that would be much appreciated.
Excellent, Greg. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.